It's almost July, which means fantasy football drafts are going to be starting up soon. Personally, I like to do my drafts closer to the regular season, like 1 to 2 weeks before, but I know a lot of people who like to draft throughout July and into the beginning of August. I don't necessarily think it's the smartest decision, considering there's a possibility of star players getting injured during the preseason or training camp, but I also understand that sometimes you just have to draft on a day whenever everybody in your league is available. Today, I simply want to give you a list of 5 quarterbacks who I believe aren't being thought of as top fantasy quarterbacks heading into the season, but by the end of it, could be solid starters for your team. None of the players on this list finished in the top 20 overall fantasy quarterbacks from last season, whether that be due to injury, poor play, or just being the backup for a team. Whatever the case may be, I think all 5 of these guys will still be available after the initial first wave of quarterbacks have been drafted. So if you want to prioritize skill position players while everybody else is drafting quarterbacks since they're coming off the board, this is a list of guys who will be available later that could end up playing better than some of the guys drafted before them. Starting at number 5, I have Bryce Young. This is definitely the guy I'm most hesitant on because, to put it bluntly, his rookie season was really disappointing. But in his defense, the Panthers as a whole were a disaster last season. Specifically on the offensive side of the ball, their O-line was graded as one of the worst overall units in the league, and his number 1 target was 33-year-old Adam Thielen. So yeah, not great. There are 2 main reasons that I think Bryce Young could have a much better season in 2024. The first is that they spent a lot of money on the offensive line in free agency, plus they added a lot of new targets for Bryce to throw to. They traded for Deontay Johnson from Pittsburgh, who's one of the most underrated route runners and separators in the league, and they drafted both Xavier Legette, who is a big-bodied receiver with excellent straight-line speed, as well as Jatavion Sanders, who is one of the best receiving tight ends in the draft. The second reason I have optimism for Bryce Young is because of the Panthers' new head coach, Dave Canales. Canales was the offensive coordinator for the Buccaneers last season during Baker Mayfield's career resurgence, where he finished number 10 in overall quarterback fantasy points. Now, just because Baker had a good season with Dave Canales doesn't mean Bryce Young will do the same, but I think he's in a much better situation than he was in last year. And don't forget, Bryce Young won the Heisman in college and was the number 1 overall pick in the draft for a reason. You can make a great argument that it should have been CJ Stroud instead, but either way, Bryce was going to be in the top 2 picks no matter what. He showed flashes of his talent last year, and now, with a revamped offensive line and receiving core, plus a smart offensive head coach, Bryce Young could end up having a much better season than people are expecting. Next up, at number 4, I have Will Levis, another quarterback going into his second season. The reason I'm pretty high on Levis this year for fantasy is because Tennessee is going to throw the ball a lot more than we're used to. Why do I think that? Well, there's a man named Derrick Henry who is no longer there. That's why. Of course, this doesn't mean that they're not going to run the ball at all anymore, but what I'm saying is I think their offense is going to be a lot more balanced than the run-heavy team that we're used to. And if you watched Will Levis in any of the games that he played in this past season, you notice that the man has an absolute cannon. He's also got a plethora of targets to throw to in D-Hop, Calvin Ridley, Tyler Boyd, and Treylon Burks, a guy I'm really hoping has a good season this year. So do I think that Will Levis is going to finish as a top 5 fantasy quarterback this season? Absolutely not. But do I think he's a guy that can go under the radar and may shock some people? Yes, I do. Moving on to number 3, I have Sam Darnold. Is he on this list because I'm a Vikings fan? Potentially, but I do genuinely think that he's a chance to put up a lot of points in fantasy this upcoming year. He's not going to be asked to carry the offense every single Sunday, but KOC is going to ask him to sling the ball to the playmakers around him. He's got Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, Aaron Jones, so many dudes that if he can just get the ball to them, they'll go make the plays. I think there's a good chance that JJ McCarthy sits behind him all year, so if you're worried about him getting benched mid-season, it's looking less and less likely that that's going to happen. Again, he's not going to be asked to do anything special. He just needs to be the Brock Purdy of this offense. And if you didn't know, Brock Purdy was actually 6th overall in quarterback fantasy points last year. So hey, take a chance on Sam Darnold in one of your leagues, even if that's just holding on to him as a backup, and by mid-season, he might just be your starter. At number 2, I have Kyler Murray. I feel like a lot of people forgot about him last year because he missed the first half of the season recovering from an ACL injury. But when he did finally get on the field, he played great both from a football standpoint and a fantasy football standpoint. He now has a new wide receiver 1 in Marvin Harrison Jr. that he gets to throw to, and also don't forget about all the rushing points that he consistently gets. I can easily see Kyler getting back to what he was a couple years ago and finishing as a top 10, even 7 fantasy quarterback at the end of the year. And finally, at number 1, I have Anthony Richardson. Out of the 4 games he played in last season, he had 2 top 5 quarterback fantasy point finishes. When you combine his passing ability, which was much better than expected for such a raw quarterback prospect, with his rushing ability, there's no reason Anthony Richardson can't be one of the best fantasy quarterbacks going forward. I love the Colts offense with Jonathan Taylor, Michael Pittman Jr., Josh Downs, A.D. Mitchell, a solid O-line. I can't wait to see Anthony Richardson get back to playing with this group. If he can just stay healthy all season, and I know that's a big if, I could see AR-15 finishing as a top 5 fantasy quarterback in total points this upcoming season and cementing himself as one of the top quarterbacks to prioritize going into future fantasy football drafts. Alright, that's going to do it for my list of 5 sleeper quarterbacks going into fantasy football drafts for the 2024 season. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like and subscribe. It helps out the channel a ton. Also, feel free to leave a comment on if you agree or disagree with my list and what quarterbacks you think are sleepers going into this fantasy football season. I truly do appreciate you watching, and I'll see you in the next one.